So let me welcome everybody to the January 22nd meeting of the New Hampshire Network for Energy, Environment, and Climate. My name's Mary Beth Raven. I'm a member of the steering committee and a over 30-year resident of the town of Merrimack, New Hampshire. And I am very pleased to introduce to you tonight Don Kreis, who is our New Hampshire consumer advocate. I'm not going to do too much of a biography because he's going to tell you a little bit about what he's done in the role of the consumer advocate as part of his talk. Don may not remember meeting me that much, but I have seen Don in many different venues from at the State House and more recently as a member of the New Hampshire's two-member Consumer Liaison Group. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Don.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you to the New Hampshire Network for inviting me to chat with you all this evening. Uh, as Mary Beth said, my name is Don. I'm a lawyer, and since February 13th of 2016, so almost 9 years ago, I've had the honor of serving as New Hampshire's consumer advocate. And my title is a bit misleading in that I don't do free range consumer advocacy. My focus and that of the small, little, scrappy state agency that I run is strictly on the interests of residential utility customers in the industries that are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. So essentially, we're talking about electricity, natural gas is provided by Unitil and Liberty in a pretty big swath of the state, and also water when it is provided by investor-owned water utilities like Aquarian or the Pennachuck Corporation and its subsidiaries. So, uh, why do we exist? Well, there are about 45 states around the country that have some form of an office like this, a state designated ratepayer advocate. And the reason is that utilities, these regulated industries, are considered natural monopolies. So they need to be rate regulated, lest they be allowed to extract monopoly rents from their customers. And the utility regulators at the state and the federal level are supposed to balance the interests of the utilities shareholders, profit maximizing investors on the one hand, and the interests of the utility customers on the other. Well, what do utility shareholders want? They want maximum return on their investment. What do customers want? They want safe and reliable service at the lowest possible cost. And I think what they also want in New Hampshire is a measure of freedom and agency, right? Because we're the live free or die state. So customers want power and autonomy. And so I work on getting them. And when I'm there in front of the PUC or in other places advocating on behalf of residential utility customers, I'm throwing some weight on the other side of the scale so that the customer interests are well represented. And we throw that up against the very well represented electric and other utilities. And that, at least in theory, makes it easier for the Public Utilities Commission and other deciders to make reasonable and balanced decisions. New Hampshire has had some form of the Office of the Consumer Advocate dating all the way back to 1976, when I was a mere tot. In those days, if you've been around since then, you might remember the Legislative Utility Consumers Council that eventually morphed into the Office of the Consumer Advocate. And it has bounced around a little bit, but since sometime in the 1990s, it's been a completely independent agency. So although the Consumer Advocate is appointed by the governor, I was originally appointed by Governor Hassan back in early 2016. I was twice reappointed by Governor Sununu because the Consumer Advocate's term lasts for 4 years. So I have a record of having been appointed bipartisanly by governors. But the governor is not free to just replace the consumer advocate with someone that she likes better at the end of the consumer advocate's term, because we have a thing called the Residential Ratepayers Advisory Board, and its job is to screen candidates when the job is open, when the incumbent consumer advocate wants to be reappointed, The Residential Ratepayers Advisory Board is a gatekeeper. It gets to say yay or nay to that proposition. And if it doesn't recommend you for reappointment, that's it. You're done with your job at the end of your term. That happened to the person who had the job back before I did when I came on board in 2016. So that's the general sort of lay of the land in terms of our office. I have uh, five people who work for me. I have an assistant consumer advocate who's a lawyer. I have a staff attorney who's a lawyer, and I have two analysts. And we also use a bunch of outside consultants. So one of the three big questions that I was asked to address is how does a consumer advocate work with the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission? And the answer is that I'm kind of a literalist. We don't really work with the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission. We appear in front of the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission as a party in all of its proceedings, or at least all of its important proceedings, because we're automatically considered a party when we want to participate. So we litigate in front of the PUC. And another agency that does the same thing as us from a somewhat different perspective is the New Hampshire Department of Energy. So the New Hampshire Department of Energy, which is just a little less than it's 3.5 years old now, its job is to basically represent the executive branch's policy agenda in front of the PUC and to help the PUC develop a full record. So the Department of Energy is there as a party, we're there as a party, and the PUC commissioners, the three of them, are up there as the deciders on matters that require that balancing of interests between shareholder interests and consumer interests on the other hand. So the first of the three questions is, what is a consumer advocate and how do New Hampshire ratepayers benefit from having one? And I thought about the different ways that I could try to answer that question. And I decided that the most topical one would be to talk a little bit about the pending Eversource rate case. So if you look on your electric bill, if you haven't done it recently, you'll see that there are a whole bunch of charges on your electric bill. And one of those charges is the energy charge, so the price you actually pay for the actual electricity that comes out of your socket. And the other charges are distribution service and transmission service, and then there are a few miscellaneous charges. Distribution service and transmission service charges pay for the poles and wires. Transmission is the bulk power high voltage transmission system that's regulated federally at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And distribution charges pay for the poles and wires that actually reach out into all of our neighborhoods and connect with our houses and businesses. And the distribution charges are the subject of this rate case that is now pending at the Public Utilities Commission. And Eversource would like to, which is the dominant electric utility in New Hampshire. It has, I think, about 500,000 customers or so, and about 70% of the state. And they would like to raise their distribution rates by a whopping big 48%, at least for residential customers. So naturally, we are participating in that case. And tomorrow, as it happens, we are about to file with the PUC a big pile of written, pre-filed direct testimony. The way that PUC proceedings work is a little bizarre if you're used to going to court, in that witnesses who testify at the PUC typically file their testimony in writing, their direct testimony, and then in theory, the hearings themselves are really just for cross-examination. So Eversource begins the rate case with a whole pile of written testimony. And tomorrow we will be filing our testimony. And our testimony is pretty targeted because we don't have the bandwidth to cover all of the issues in the rate case. And one of my favorite issues in this or any other rate case is return on equity. The question is, because this is one of the components of utility rates, is what is a reasonable return on shareholder investment for a company like Public Service Company of New Hampshire doing business as Eversource Energy? And you can think about that in terms of your own life and your own investments, right? Like, like if you invest $1,000 in something, what and you put that capital at risk, say it's stock, so you might actually lose some of that investment. What amount of return is it reasonable for you to expect over the course of a year in exchange for that investment? Well, according to Eversource, what its shareholders are entitled to earn on their investment is a whopping big 10.3%. And we are about to file testimony tomorrow that basically says that is about 22 basis points too high. So we think the right number isn't 10.3%. It's really 8.13%. That's a pretty big delta in percentage terms. We want to lop off about a quarter of that proposed return on equity. And based on that difference alone, if we touched nothing else in the rate case, if we didn't disallow any of the expenses that Eversource thinks that it's entitled to recover on, or if we didn't trim their expenses in any other fashion, that would reduce Eversource's net income by $27 million. So compare that $27 million to the $1.1 million a year budget of our whole office, and you start to see, from my perspective at least, what value we deliver to the constituency whose interests we serve. Now, will we succeed in reining in return on equity to the tune of $27 million? To be candid, it's unlikely the PUC will completely agree with us, but we will get some of that. And so, again, that's a little bit of you got a little bit of a feeling for what value we deliver. The shareholders of a public utility are entitled to a return on and a return of their investment. Lots and lots of people think that somehow there is money that utilities pony up, that the shareholders of the utility bear certain costs in their role as shareholders. But that is not true. They front investment money in utilities. They do that, but they do get both a return on their investment and a return of their investment. So the return on their investment, interest essentially, is what I was talking about before when I was talking about return on investment. And the way they get a return of their investment is through the depreciation charges that are embedded in your electric rates. That makes depreciation expenses, that's a really esoteric accounting topic, right? I bet there isn't a single person here other than me that sits around thinking about depreciation. Maybe a couple of you do, I don't know. But it's a big deal in rate cases. So we're going to put in depreciation testimony tomorrow. And that is going to say that of the $92 million in annual depreciation costs that Eversource would like to recover from its customers, we think that should be trimmed back to about $74 million. So that's another $18 million a year that we don't think that Eversource should be allowed to collect from its customers over the course of a year, and in connection with that 48% increase in its distribution rates that Eversource is trying to get the PUC to approve. So those are just two big issues that we're taking up in the rate case. And if you add 27 million and 18 million, what does that come to? It's about 45 million bucks if my law school math is correct. And again, when I think about justifying the existence of my office, I compare numbers like that to the $1.1 million a year that it takes to actually run the Office of the Consumer Advocate at our present staffing level of 6 people. So why am I so obsessed with that kind of justification? And the answer might be obvious to many of you, if not all of you. There is a bill pending in the legislature, House Bill 610, that would abolish my office altogether and fold its functions into the Department of Energy. The bill would give the Commissioner of Energy the opportunity to appoint a new consumer advocate and a new assistant consumer advocate. I think the other 4 positions in my office would disappear, and those 2 people would no longer be independent of the governor and his commissioner of energy. I think that would be a huge mistake. Independence is one of our most effective and salient weapons as we carry on these struggles on behalf of the state's residential utility customers. And when I say that, I'm not really trying to trash or even criticize the policy imperatives of the governor or the executive branch of our state, really, or any other state. I mean, the governor's objectives as the chief executive of the state aren't completely or solely focused on utility ratepayers when she or he thinks about energy. The governor has the interests of the utilities to keep in mind and the interests of the business community and economic development issues. Something I've been resolute about, to the annoyance at various times of politicians of all stripes, is I try to keep stuff out of utility rates that should be paid for, if at all, through taxes. So if you're talking about economic development in the North Country, that sort of thing, if you want to keep the forest industry in the part of the state above the notches viable, that's great. I think that's important. I don't think we should pay for it through our electric bills. I think if we want as a state to be promoting economic development in any sector of our economy or any region of our state, that's what taxes are for. That's not what utility bills are for. So I've been resolute about that. It's something Governor Sununu, I think, liked about me, and it's something that did not necessarily endear me to some of the state's Democratic politicians. So I'm concerned about the bill that would abolish our office because I see what happens in neighboring states that have either no ratepayer advocate or no independent ratepayer advocate. So I just noticed the other day that my counterpart in Pennsylvania, who is an extremely effective ratepayer advocate, very outspoken, very articulate, very effective, he's being driven out of office by the state's newly elected attorney general because his office, his name is Pat Cicero, and Pat's office is part of the attorney general's office in Pennsylvania. And the attorney general is in the process of driving Pat Cicero straight out of office. Closer to home, my counterpart in Maine is called the public advocate, and my very distinguished Maine colleague, Bill Harwood, is in the process of retiring. And Governor Mills of Maine has nominated a new public advocate, and she barely survived a committee vote over there and almost her nomination almost went down in flames. Why? Because politicians in the caucus in Maine that are not in the same political party as the governor think, and I think they're correct, that the public advocate in Maine is not sufficiently independent of the governor. So here in New Hampshire, no governor has ever told me what to do. Governor Hassan didn't do it. Governor Sununu didn't do it. And I don't think that Governor Ayotte is going to do it either. If you look over at Vermont, now Vermont has a Department of Public Service, which is similar to our Department of Energy, and they have a director for public advocacy inside of the Department of Public Service. But all he does is advocate on behalf of whatever the governor's energy policy agenda is. And that state just assumes that whatever the governor thinks is in the general public interest is good for ratepayers. And that's just not, I think that is a demonstrably incorrect assumption. And so I am really, I don't know if I would say I'm excited, but I am pleased to accept the opportunity to go downtown to the State House and explain to skeptical lawmakers what it is that we do and why our independence is our most important attribute. So that bill's been referred to the Committee on Executive Departments and Administration. I don't know when they're going to have their hearing on the bill, but I will be there to testify at that hearing. And I hope some of you will be there too to testify at that hearing. I heard somebody talking, and I just want to make sure I didn't need to stop and listen to somebody or something. I don't think so. The third of the big questions that I was asked is how does a consumer advocate work with the ISO New England Consumer Liaison Group? And what is the Consumer Liaison Group and why should you care? That is a really excellent question. And in order to answer it adequately, I have to take a step or two back and tell you what ISO New England is. So, ISO New England is known in the industry parlance as a regional transmission organization, and it is a ostensibly or is a nonprofit organization, and its job is to run the region's bulk power transmission system, meaning the high voltage poles and wires that we use to move power around all of the New England region and and it also operates and administers the markets through which wholesale electricity is bought and sold. And when I say wholesale electricity, I mean the same thing you do by the word wholesale. It's just energy that is bought and sold for resale, ultimately at retail to end user regular customers like all of us. So ISO New England does all of those things. And because it was set up voluntarily by the formerly vertically integrated utilities that used to own everything and that still own everything. uh, it was set up on terms that are extremely favorable to the legacy interests, meaning big transmission owners like Eversource and National Grid, big generation owners like Constellation and Next Era, and big industrial customers of electricity. And so, as a kind of uh, because this all was set up voluntarily, uh, in order to get FERC to approve this thing, there had to be some sort of vehicle for so-called stakeholders to have an influence on ISO New England. So what used to be the New England Power Pool or NEPOOL was converted into a big stakeholder advisory body. And again, the rules of NEPOOL, the voting rules, are jiggered to favor the legacy interests. So my office is actually a voting member of NEPOOL, but we're part of a sector called the end user sector that has just 12.8% of the voting power in NEPOOL. So no matter what we do, we and others who are sort of arguing from the same place that we are never going to have more than 12.8% of the voting power. What that means, I would say, and I know ISO New England is listening to me here, is that the legacy owners of the system essentially wield veto power over anything ISO New England does and anything any of us ratepayer interests would like to see happen. So, as a kind of concession to all of that, ISO New England started this little thing called the Consumer Liaison Group. And it did that because via Order 719, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission told these regional transmission organizations that they had to set up some kind of a vehicle that would serve as a connection between the regular people who use the system, us, and the board of directors of the regional transmission organization. And ISO New England has a completely unaccountable board of directors. It is a nonprofit organization. It's incorporated in Delaware. None of us have any governance rights at ISO New England. But what we do have is this thing called the Consumer Liaison Group, and it is the forum through which ISO New England its board is supposed to listen to all of us. Well, I started going to the quarterly Consumer Liaison Group meetings when I first became consumer advocate. And 2 years later, I got myself elected to the coordinating committee of the Consumer Liaison Group. And what I discovered to my absolute and eternal annoyance is that the Consumer Liaison Group is basically a big coffee clutch. Like every 3 months, there'd be another one of these meetings in a windowless hotel ballroom somewhere, and it rotates around the region, and it would just be very cozy and lots of talk about nothing really. And so I decided to do what I could to make the Consumer Liaison Group into a more vibrant forum. And I eventually discovered that I found common purpose in doing that with a bunch of climate activists who operate under the banner of no coal, no gas. Well, the no coal, no gas people were getting on my nerves because they were busy staging all kinds of civil disobedience stunts down at Merrimack Station right here in Bow. They would show up in the middle of the night and block a train coming in to deliver coal to Merrimack Station because Merrimack Station burns coal, which they hate. Or they would climb the stacks at one of these plants like Merrimack Station or Schiller Station down in Portsmouth, just as a kind of, well, I don't want to speak for them, but just that was their strategy for gaining attention. And I eventually figured out how to get in touch with them. And I said, you folks, I think you're wasting your time. If you really want to go somewhere where you can have an actual influence, check out this consumer liaison group thing. And by the way, you can even run for election if you want to the coordinating committee of the consumer liaison group. Well, they took that idea to heart, and a bunch of them 2 years ago, or I guess more than 2 years ago now, got themselves elected to the coordinating committee, six of them. So they ended up taking over six of the 12 seats on the coordinating committee. And that turned the consumer liaison group into a much more vibrant forum for essentially talking back to ISO New England. Now, my relationship to all of this has been seriously misunderstood in certain quarters. I am not a climate activist. That is not my job. I am not the Lorax. There are other organizations, and you all know which organizations I'm talking about, that are very, very good at carrying that particular banner into all of the relevant forums where public policy gets debated and decided, including the PUC, including ISO New England, including the legislature. I don't do that. I am laser focused on ratepayer interests, but where I find common purpose with the climate activists is in this need to make ISO New England and its stakeholder advisory body, NEPOOL, and its vehicle for talking back to the board of directors, the consumer liaison group, truly responsive and accountable publicly so that the uh, so that ISO New England is no longer to 21st century New England as Robert Moses was to 1950s New York City. My apologies for making that particular analogy. Those of you who, like me, come from New York might relate to that. But the best work of nonfiction ever written is this book called The Power Broker, which is a biography of Robert Moses that was written by Robert Caro. And it really describes a man who came to acquire essentially unchecked power with, hundreds of millions of dollars at his disposal to build whatever he wanted and do whatever he wanted in New York City. And I worry that ISO New England is a lot like that in New England. And, again, it's a nonprofit. It isn't making any money on its own. It's not allowed to, but it's perpetuating the interests of the legacy owners of our electricity grid. And it's not that I don't think those legacy owners have no legitimate interests. It's just that I think that we really need to have some balance in this so that there is, as there is supposed to be at the state level, balancing of the interests of the people who own all this stuff and those of us who depend on it and who pay 100% for it. Gosh, I could go on and on and on. Maybe I should stop there and see if it's time for some of you to ask me questions. I did. Mary Beth gave me a really long list of really interesting questions that people put in advance, and I could certainly start going through those if you want. But I thought maybe this would be a good time to stop and see if there's anybody in the live audience who wants to ask me something.
I would
If
pick up on something that you said, Don, if I could,
Sure.
which is you were talking about the independence and the importance of independence to your position, and I'm just wondering whether you think it sounded as though that's an assumption that other people also make, and I'm just wondering whether you think that's going to continue to be true in the near and farther future, or whether that independence of your position is actually going to be a sticking point. and will rub people the wrong way, and maybe already is doing so.
Well, again, I think that's a driving force behind the bill that has been introduced, House Bill 610. So the title of the bill is something like a bill to abolish the office of the consumer advocate.
Hmm.
And that is literally what it does, but then it creates a new consumer advocate within the Department of Energy. That person, whoever she or he is, if the bill becomes law, will not be independent. And that person will report to the Commissioner of Energy, who reports up to the governor. And I guarantee you that what you will see that person do is advance the policy agenda of the Department of Energy. In legal terms, you're going to have to forgive me because I'm a lawyer, but any lawyer who a lawyer has a conflict of interest problem if they are working for the department and thus have the Department of Energy as their client, but also working on behalf of ratepayers. That is a different client, and those interests aren't equivalent to each other. So it isn't really possible in terms of legal ethics, I guess you could say, for any one attorney to represent both of those interests at the same time. One of them will essentially have to be thrown off the back of the truck. And I confidently predict that the interests that will get thrown off the back of the truck are the ratepayer interests. So that's why I think adopting the bill would be a big, big mistake. One of the questions that I got in writing from Mary Beth was something to the effect of, is this like aimed at me personally? And I guess I don't really know the answer to that question because I haven't really had detailed discussions with any of the bill's sponsors or co-sponsors. I did have a conversation with one of them, and it didn't sound to me like he had it in for me personally. It's more like this is driven by the House Majority Office and the imperative there to try to, kind of curb waste in government. We are not wasting money. We are returning value to ratepayers in the form of rate relief that nobody else is seeking, and therefore nobody else is delivering. If the question is how can we address the problem of waste in state government in the realm of energy regulation, I could give you a long list of ways in which the state is wasting money in the course of regulating energy, but spoiler alert, it is not coming from my scrappy little office of 6 people. It is elsewhere in the Walker Building where I work.
So the interesting thing for our membership might be to keep in mind that what we might want to be arguing for is actually independence. It's not for the position of consumer advocate or anything like that, because that's not the question. The question is, where is that position going to be placed, and how independent would you be able to continue to be? So it's the independence that people want to keep focused on.
I think that's right. I think that is the first and foremost the question. It does look like the bill, if I'm reading it correctly, would eliminate 4 of the 6 positions in my office. I mean,
All right.
it wipes out our statute, and I assume that wipes out all of our jobs, and then it creates 2 jobs in the Department of Energy. A lot of that would have to be sort of played out in the course of the deliberations about the state budget. That's really where the personnel issues get hashed out because that's how we pay. That's how we create positions by deciding to pay them.
Yeah. Yeah, and cutting personnel like that would also seriously damage your independence, your ability to function independently, because you'd be dependent on other kinds of data gathering and so forth, research.
Or just not function at all. I mean, if you
Yeah.
tell a group of 6 people that whatever they're doing is in the future going to have to be accomplished by 2 people, if you just did that and you retained us as an independent agency, we would have we would have the ability to do almost nothing. I mean, it wouldn't be nothing, but it would be almost nothing.
Mhm.
So, Don, can you, I know I heard this from other people and it's on Mary Beth's list. So what is the rate of return on our investment in you. How much money are you saving ratepayers, you and your office?
Yeah, so that is a question that several people have urged me to try to answer in the course of this conversation that we're going to be having this spring about the Office of the Consumer Advocate. And I really resist answering that because it's very often we're working in concert with others, right? So uh, it's unusual for us to be able to claim sole credit for ratepayer savings. I mean, I am going to sit down and see if I can come up with a reasonably conservative estimate of what we can actually take credit for. I mean, on a case by case basis, we were responsible for preventing Liberty Utilities from keeping $4 million that it mistakenly collected from its gas customers last year, 2 years ago. I mean, they just popped up in front of the PUC and said, well, we collected or we failed to collect $4 million that we should have collected. So can we have it now? And my answer, and this is the legal doctrine, was no give backsies. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. And of course, we were right. And it was our job as the ratepayer advocate to pop up and say, no, you may not do that. And we were right. Um, So there are different examples of that occurring over time. And every time and I'm always thinking of it in terms of like, how does that compare to the cost of having the OCA? So right now there are six of us, and we collectively cost about 1.1 million bucks a year. So every time I can say I just saved $4 million, that more than offsets the cost of having our office.
I see we've got some great questions in the chat. Merrick Kotelba, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, I can just read his question.
Oh,
He
okay.
asks, or they ask, is the Eversource proposed distribution rate increase 42% or 48%? I've seen both figures in articles. That's a really good question. And the answer is this. The 42% is the overall rate increase that applies across the board to all customers, but Eversource is trying to grab a bigger piece of that pie from residential customers. And I forgot what I calculated the difference between 42% or 48% is, but that's part of our argument as well. Like my argument is basically, even if you're entitled to that rate increase, you can't assign a disproportionate share of it to residential customers. That's why the 48% is the rate increase Eversource wants to impose on the residential class. That is the class I care about solely. The theory being that the commercial and industrial customers, they have other advocates like the Business and Industry Association that can argue on their behalf. And then the next part of that question is based on my experience, what do I think the increase will actually be? A non-binding estimate. Thank you. Of course, it would be non-binding. Will the increase be phased in over 3 years or some other period of time? So you have to kind of keep in mind that Eversource isn't coming in every year and asking for a 48% increase. So if you're thinking, well, that's so vastly in excess of inflation, it's because depending on how you count it, it's really been 2 or 3 years since the Eversource has had any rate increase. And it basically becomes retroactive to the point at which they filed their rate case, which was last May. So we've already given them a temporary rate increase to get them halfway there. So just based on past experience, without analyzing the merits of anything that's actually unfiled here, a utility usually gets around half of what they ask for. Usually, maybe a little more, 60%, something like that. So instead of a 48% increase or a 42% increase, you might be looking at a 20 or 30% increase. And again, that's probably about commensurate with the rate of inflation. So, holding them to zero or forcing them to actually lower their rates, it's just not feasible in an inflationary climate. The utility regulator in Connecticut has actually imposed a rate decrease on Aquarian, which is a water utility in Connecticut, and has come down very hard on utilities. All hell is breaking loose in Connecticut. If any of you have any spare time to look at what's going on in other states, check out what's going down in Connecticut.
We've got two other questions in chat if you've got time for them.
Oh, well, I can go on all night. So, uh, given that the executive, this is a question from Jennifer Smith, given that the executive branch is elected and has to raise money from businesses and people who are shareholders in businesses like the utilities, wouldn't this bill promote further regulatory capture in the electricity monopoly? Absolutely. Uh, you know, Regulatory capture is a real thing. And it happens all the time. You would do it too if you were a utility, right? You would attempt to build, to the extent you can, warm and friendly personal relationships with the people who are in charge of regulating and scrutinizing you. I used to be general counsel of the New Hampshire PUC back in the first decade of this century. And back then, my kids were little. So I was like talking about them all the time. And I used to say, every utility lawyer in the state knows the names of my two kids. And they might still, but that's how regulatory capture works. And then there is a question from Sarah Thorne. Other than submitting testimony to the committee members, where are our greatest points of leverage to defeat this proposal? Well, as you all know, because you're all you're all astute actors when it comes to the legislature, this thing goes in phases because it goes before the House first. So I think the bill has been assigned to executive departments and administration. And yes, you can and should communicate with members of that committee. But the bill will go to the floor one way or another, and there will be a floor fight over the bill. So it is not too early for you to connect with your member or members of the House, regardless of what committee those members are on, and let them know that you do not agree with House Bill 610. And then, should the bill end up being approved in some form by the House, then it goes over to the Senate and will, if that happens, then the volume level will get cranked up a little higher, and will undertake a more, aggressive effort to make the case against the bill. But at this stage, before executive departments and administration, we're just going to straight up walk the high road and make an earnest and sincere and forthright case about why what we do is important and why our independence is crucial to our success. Another idea, says my friend and predecessor as consumer advocate, is to also reach out to the governor early. That is true as well, although what we're finding right this minute is that Governor Ayotte is extremely busy scrambling to put together her budget proposal. And so it's really not possible to kind of get in to see or even communicate with anybody in the governor's office right now. Once they get through their budgeting ordeal and have a budget to transmit to the House Finance Committee, then I'm hoping it'll be a little easier to get some FaceTime with the governor and her people and explain to them why the OCA is important and why there are certain other things that the governor should really think about and do in the energy realm, because there is a lot broken about energy regulation in New Hampshire right now. I could spend an hour just giving you the highlights of that, but the elevator speech version of that is that we rejiggered energy regulation in New Hampshire in 2021 by creating the Department of Energy and reconfiguring the Public Utilities Commission, but none of that has worked the way it is supposed to work. And it needs fixing. I'm just going to take a sip of my Diet Dr. Pepper and see who else wants to ask me a question.
Well, I'd say feel free to expand on that. That's if that is a safe topic for you.
I've talked about this before, and have incurred the wrath of Chairman Goldner of the Public Utilities Commission as a result. I think this is just me talking, and I could be wrong, but this is how it looks to me, as somebody who has worked in or near the Public Utilities Commission since 1999, that basically the two agencies are somehow they've gotten, what's the word? They've kind of gotten reversed, like the Department of Energy is supposed to be the policy shop, right? Like it is supposed to be pursuing what one would hope is a vibrant or even aggressive policy agenda on behalf of the governor, essentially, the executive branch of state government. And you would think that the PUC, rather than being an aggressive avatar of policy, would be more like a court, right? More of a neutral decision maker, and just kind of sitting up there as the oracle up on the bench, waiting for the Department of Energy and the consumer advocate and the utilities and the other stakeholders to come and present evidence to the PUC that the PUC could then use to make decisions. But it's flipped. So the PUC is pursuing an aggressive policy agenda, much of which I disagree with. And the Department of Energy has been very cautious and conservative and just reluctant to take up its mandate to pursue policy in an aggressive and forthright way. So that's more of a long elevator ride up a skyscraper version of my answer to that. And I'm not trying to trash any of the actual human beings that are doing this work. I know them all, and they're all nice, well-intentioned people. But I just think kind of the way it's all sort of worked out, the way all these new agencies are relating to each other and the way these people are interacting has led to this weird role reversal. And I'm trying to fix that. I talked Representative Corman of Lebanon into introducing a bill on my behalf that would try to address some of these issues, this sort of inversion, and it'll get heard, and we'll see. Somebody asked me about the letter that Chairman Goldner wrote to my advisory board. So we first raised some of these concerns with my advisory board back when it met in October, and that resulted in Chairman Goldner sending a very vituperative letter to the advisory board that kind of went after me personally. Well, I'm a big kid. I can take that, but I think intemperate remarks like that on the part of a quasi-judicial decision maker are problematic, right? Because the ratepayers, the ratepayer interests that I represent are entitled to a neutral decision maker. I mean, imagine, if you think about it in prosecutorial terms, imagine if the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of New Hampshire, wrote a public letter excoriating the U.S. attorney for the District of New Hampshire, who's responsible for prosecuting federal crime in New Hampshire. Like that wouldn't be cool. It would be a judicial ethics problem. And I think it's a problem for the PUC that the chairman chose to do that. I did not. I thought about it, but I decided not to file, a motion to disqualify the chairman and the other commissioner who signed that letter from every case I'm appearing in. I thought that would be really divisive and unhelpful, so I didn't do it. But it was problematic. What's the next question?
I have a quick question. This is sort of a little bit a different avenue here, but do you know which are the 5 states approximately that have no consumer advocate and why they don't?
So if you go to the website of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, there is a roster of our membership. And I know that Louisiana doesn't have one. I don't believe that Mississippi has one. And off the top of my head, I can't think of what the other 3 states are. And uh, you know, this is the United States of America. We're a laboratory of democracy here. We have 50 different polities with 50 different approaches to government. I'm not really here to condemn the 5 states that don't have ratepayer advocates. And there are in NASUCA, some of those 45 states have ratepayer advocates that are way less independent than me. And so they're kind of in the gray area. And, I don't necessarily criticize any state's approach to how it handles utility regulation. I mean, if you look at a state like Montana, for example, Montana has I have a counterpart in Montana, and the 5 commissioners of the PUC in Montana are all elected by the voters of that state. The state's divided up into 5 PUC districts or 5 Public Service Commission districts, and you get to vote for your PUC commissioner. That's an interesting experiment. I don't think it's a good idea, but several states have tried it, and there's some doctoral thesis, I guess, to be had about determining whether these elected commissioners do a good job vis-a-vis commissioners like ours who were appointed. So there's all kinds of different approaches to this. I'm just trying to figure out what's good for New Hampshire. And I think we should hold on to what we have because the Office of the Consumer Advocate has been very impactful over the years here in New Hampshire.
Bill
So,
Darcy, did
James?
you have your hand up? Did you? Well, you're on mute, Bill.
Yeah, I did. I did have my hand up. Don, I'm familiar also with a wide variety of how states do this. You heard my testimony the other day that I was a consumer advocate in Connecticut, and I was actually appointed by the PUC, and my 6-member organization was in the PUC. But I actually had independence because no, commissioner ever asked me to do anything while I was in that position. And you mentioned, the Pennsylvania one where they were technically within the Attorney General's office. I mean that presents a possible conflict too, and it's really whether or not the elected people, repress a desire to interfere or not. I mean, like you said, while you're appointed by the governor hasn't told you to do anything, but they could. I mean, they could try, they could say, Don, you're way off base on this. If you want reappointment, you're not going to get it. So, independence is a very, uh, it's a thing that there are formal structures and informal structures. And I just wanted you to comment on that generally.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that my counterpart in Connecticut is a very thoughtful and aggressive lawyer named Clara Coleman. And as far as I know, she is completely independent of any other agency in Connecticut. She doesn't work for what's now called the PURA, the uh, Public Utility Regulatory Authority. So she's like me. She's completely independent. But whether you're talking about Clara Coleman or whether you're talking about Bill Darcy or whether you're talking about me, if you're appointed to a term of office and if you don't act with the independence that's been vested in you because you're afraid of what will happen when your term expires, then maybe you just lack the requisite courage and integrity to do the job as well as it deserves to be done. I mean, I've never pulled punches about anything during my 9 years as ratepayer advocate. That isn't to say I'm oblivious to the way what I do is going to be received, right? I mean, none of us is ever completely independent. People can criticize you. They can threaten your budget. They can threaten to abolish your or repeal your statute. So there's always threats to one's independence. But I don't know any other official in New Hampshire state government who enjoys the degree of independence that I do. I mean, and it's because of the advisory board that insulates me from direct pressure from the governor. And to the credit of Governor Sununu in particular, I mean, he knows that I'm not a Republican and I'm not a registered anything. But, if you consider the fact that I was originally appointed by a Democratic governor who I knew from her days in the state Senate, if you concluded from that my personal political proclivities probably skew pretty blue, you'd be right. But Governor Sununu, to his credit, decided to reappoint me twice. It's because he respected me as an independent actor that didn't report to him. And I think that, I have more than 2.5 years left on my term. And I intend to act with total independence from Governor Ayotte. At the same time, I'm eager to establish a good relationship with her. I'd like to know what her energy agenda is because she hasn't had time to articulate it yet. And I'm hopeful that there'll be plenty of common ground to find with her and what she and whatever her energy people are going to be trying to do. Because whether we have a Republican governor or a Republican majority in the legislature, or whether the other party takes control of things, there's plenty of stuff that can be done within the context of those partisan agendas to advance the interests of ratepayers. There's a pro-ratepayer take on the Republican policy agenda. There's a pro-ratepayer take on the Democratic Party partisan agenda. And depending on who's in charge, I pursue one or both of those things as appropriate. Thank you, Bill. That was a really good question.
Well, we've got 3 minutes left. Do we have time for one more question? Or Susan, shall we go to the what's coming up next with New Hampshire Network? We're on mute.
So before I take over, I just wanted to point out Jeff Kerr's very interesting graph where looked like the cost of generation stayed pretty even where transmission costs went way up. I don't know if you can see that in chat, but I think red is generation.
And everybody should be able to download that graphic too.
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah, so that's really interesting and important, right? And we haven't really talked about transmission costs. So we pay the highest transmission charges in the country here in New England. We totally gold-plated our transmission grid. Right now, there are $5 billion worth of so-called asset condition transmission projects in the pipeline. So asset condition projects, that's legalese for projects that don't receive any scrutiny whatsoever. And the poster child for that is the $450 million that Eversource wants to spend rebuilding its X178 transmission line that runs up the western side of the state up to Bethlehem, New Hampshire. And they want to be able to do that without any scrutiny whatsoever. And we are trying to at least cause them to have to defend the prudence of that project. And there are, as I said, a total of $5 billion worth of that stuff in the pipeline around the region that we all pay for because these costs are socialized around the region. That, and now I speak as a former news guy, ex-journalist, that's news, folks. Like, I smell news in that $5 billion of unscrutinized transmission spending. So that graph is really important. So thank you to Jeff Kerr for sharing it.
And hint, hint, I think we have some journalists on this call whom I will not name. Okay, I'm gonna say, Don, thank you for this evening and thank you for what you do for us every day. And I hope no one takes a bit of it away from you. And
well, I look forward to the public conversation, and thank you to all of the folks who run the New Hampshire Network for inviting me. This is a really important and valuable forum. I hope the New Hampshire Network continues to prosper. It's made a real difference, and
wow.
I hope to continue to be engaged with you all.
That means a lot to hear from you. Okay, I'm going to take over fast though. Future events. Oops, I didn't do share screen. Sorry. Oh, do you have it, Mary Beth?
No, good Lord.
I've got it.
Okay, I'll stop share. Sorry.
Oh, no. Only one presenter can share at a time.
Yeah, I stopped. I should be stopped.
Okay. Here we are. Sorry, everyone. Here we go. So here is our next event, which is a week from today. So you'll get an advert for that and probably later this evening. We're going to have our legislative preview with Tony Kaplan and Wendy Thomas, who are both on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, and David Waters, very familiar with energy, but his committee is also responsible for natural resources, and they will share their views of the year ahead and ways we can best support their efforts to pass critical bills. So we definitely hope you'll join us again January 27th. And then February 10th, third annual Unwrap the Future about where we are with plastic waste, reuse, and zero waste, and what real people are really making happen. This is not fantasy and come and find out what you can do to join us. Then we have started an attempt to curb plastic bags, which for the most part are less necessary than plastic, say, catheter tubes. So if you can either use this QR code or go to www.change.org/eliminate_plastic_bags, you can sign a petition or email New Hampshire Network at gmail.com to find out how much more you can do to help spread this petition and get the word out, and see if we can together really work to get the grocery stores to talk to us and the legislators. There's going to be a bill coming up that will also touch on this. And in general, please join our efforts. We have working groups, plastics, climate, municipal energy committees, because municipal energy committees don't have any other way to talk to each other and share information, environment, and then legislation spanning all of those. And our website is pretty easy to remember, www.newhampshirenetwork.org. And that's where you can find this recording when it comes out, all the Zoom links and times and dates you need for everything we're doing, and our legislative spreadsheet, which is now really critical for knowing what are the bills that are coming up in the State House that you may want to oppose. And so here we are, New Hampshire Network. We have, oh, right, okay, weekly information, which does include funding. So you will find out about funding, the recording of past events, learn about future events. We've got a full calendar, working groups. I think that's it. Mary Beth, want to sign off?
Great. Thank you all very much. I will be posting notes and this recording to our newhampshirenetwork.org website. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Dawn.
Yep.
Thanks everybody else too.
Spread the word. Stay strong.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.